Number seems to be quite significant. I think we can start right away. Agree?
Okay, I'm ready to go. Are you going to do an introduction, or do you want me to do that?
Let me do an introduction by starting by expressing our word of gratitude for those who managed to attend or participate this teach-in seminar. We are quite grateful for you to find time, and we hope that the seminar is going to be very informative because it touches upon an interesting aspect of the development of the continent, which is the state of industrialization in Africa. Yes, industrialization in Africa is a concept that is highly contested in the sense that it is argued that the continent is at a different stages of industrialization. However, as we look forward to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, it's obvious that the continent will have to really improve in this aspect. But I'm not really a person who is an expert in terms of providing the interesting perspectives on this. And we have a speaker by the name of Dianna Games, who is going to really to take us through this aspect, which is quite interesting for the continent. Dianna Games is the Chief Executive of Business Consultancy Africa at Work, and he is a leading commentator on business trends and political economy in Africa. She is the author of many published reports on African business and is a columnist on Africa for African Business Magazine and writes for other leading publications. She is the author of the book titled Business in Africa, Corporate Insights that was published by Penguin in 2013. Dianna has traveled widely around the continent over many years, researching, writing about, and observing the development trajectories and the trends in countries over several decades. She also heads up the South Africa-Nigeria Business Chamber that is based in Johannesburg. She is an alumna of Rhodes University. With that appetite, I hope Dianna will not disappoint. Over to you, Dianna. Thank you.
Similani, thank you very much for the introduction. I just wanted to say hello before I put my slides up. I just have a couple of slides, and I'm really going to focus on the industrialization issue rather than the African free trade area. I know you have other speakers in the series, so I'm quite sure there's a lot of information being shared about that. And so I think that I want to just unpack a little bit of the issues around industrialization. As Similani said, I've been traveling around this continent for decades now, and I've seen the changes. I've seen the changes for better, for worse, and then for better again, and so on, over different countries and so on. I'm going to look at 3 countries just briefly at the end, just to analyze some of the issues that maybe we're speaking about here. So on that note, I'm just going to open my presentation, and please feel free to list questions and things for afterwards. I can't promise I'll answer everything, but I will do my best. Right. Okay, so I've to see why this is not moving on. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to get my slides to move on, and I'm not sure. Okay, there we go. Okay, all right, sorry about that. Okay, so there's a lot of reasons why industrialization makes sense, and I think a lot of them are obvious, but I'm just going to run briefly through some of these. You know, as I'm sure you know, our biggest export is raw material, raw commodities, with very little value addition. And of course, that means that the countries that produce these things are held hostage to the prices in global markets and not able to control that. So with industrialization, obviously the pricing becomes a little bit more stable, and it's less volatile. And that in turn provides a more sustainable tax base. The tax base in Africa, the tax to GDP is incredibly low. I think South Africa and a couple of North African countries. South Africa tends to mimic more the the sort of trajectory and the makeup of North African countries rather than many sub-Saharan countries. and the tax base in most countries is incredibly low, sorry, as a percentage to tax to GDP. So this is a big issue, and this is something, I mean, the savings and tax issues are big issues for governments going forward. And obviously jobs is increasingly becoming an issue. I think it always has been, but because the growth rates have been high for a long time. But I think what you're seeing now is really a more young people coming into the market. The age differential is changing. The demographic is changing slightly. So there is a more concerted effort and more discussions by African leaders to talk about job growth. There's been a lot of lip service paid about how many jobs are going to be created, how they're going to be created. And that's not just here, that's in all countries, where as soon as a politician gets on a stage, this seems to be something that's talked about, but in reality, it's not really translated or or doesn't trickle down into policy and into the economy. So this is something where industrialization has been a creator of job growth in many other countries where you've seen that industrialization. And of course, it attracts FDI. I think the biggest portion of FDI into the continent in the last few years has been into industrial enterprises. That includes energy, the oil industry and others, but also into manufacturing. And also that is once we make things and sell them, that's we can export them, and also an opportunity for SMEs to get into the value chains. SMEs traditionally make up 80% of African economies, and yet there's not enough development and not enough consideration of how to scale this size of company. There's a lot of focus when it comes to manufacturing and industrialization. There seems to be an undue focus on multinational companies and large companies, because that tends to be where the energy is expended in terms of industrialization. And of course, it's an opportunity for increased value addition. Sorry, I've repeated the jobs. But also I think that a lot of what the free trade area is going to hopefully do is for countries to produce inputs for manufacturing. A lot of the imports into Africa are not just finished goods, but import of widgets, if you like, or inputs into manufacturing. So even if the manufacturing takes place in Africa, there's a lot of imported capital equipment and various other bits and pieces that goes into the process. So when we talk about value addition and beneficiation, it's often at the other end of the chain, looking at, for example, refineries or processing gold and things like that. But actually, a lot of the value addition could be done at the front load the process as well. And that could be done in Africa rather than importing it. Okay, so these are some of the trends. And basically what's happened in Africa is we've seen a process of deindustrialization, where there's been a shift to imports. A lot of companies have closed down over the years for one reason or another, often to do with national issues, the wrong models, the changeover from colonial rule into independent countries, independently governed. And there's a lot of reasons for it, but there has definitely been a shift. And the manufacturing in 2014 was much lower than it was in 1990. So although the value has increased, but and we've seen everywhere in Africa is a big shift to imports. Africa has become an import-dependent country in all sorts of levels, from food and medicine through to consumer goods. And there's a huge amount of consumption. And if you look at the continental trade figures for Africa, you'll see that I did have them, but they're not in front of me now, where the exports was for raw materials more than 50%, and the imports for consumer goods was about 30%. And both cases the highest category of imports and exports. So that reflects where we are, and I think that is a problem. A lot of that has been the rise of China in Africa. There's a lot of cheap imports coming through, and so we can afford those, and that is putting a lot of industry out of business. And you've seen, in some cases, like the textile industry, for example, most countries in Africa, or a lot of countries in Africa, had a thriving textile industry, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. But in almost all cases, it is actually no longer there, except where you've got pockets of AGOA-related, in most cases, industry in the textile sector, making clothing, etc. Ethiopia, think Swaziland, etc. And employment in industry is fractional in sub-Saharan Africa. So where a lot of employment anyway is informal or unrecorded, but you also see a lot of certainly growing employment in the services sector. And import, what happened in the early sort of a few decades ago, there was a real trend. In fact, going back to colonial times, import substitution was a big factor in terms of driving industry. And there's a lot of issues around that, which we don't have time to go into today, but it might be something to look at because it works. In some cases it works, in other cases it doesn't. It can have effects of distorting economies. And I'll talk a little bit about Nigeria in that regard a little bit later. And really, but that is the way I think what a lot of countries are looking at is import substitution, because we are so highly import dependent. The idea is, and also we are tend to be forex starved because our exports are not substantial enough. So import substitution addresses the issue of forex availability, and most countries at the moment have a severe problem with that. It comes and goes depending on the global impact of various things that are happening. And we have declining terms of trade as well. Basically, we're importing too much and exporting too little. And local content also plays into this. It's not the same as import substitution directly, but there is a real growing trend towards local content in Africa, in economies where governments are setting benchmarks for the amount of local content and the types of content, what industries need to use, what percentage of local content, locally made product, and certainly skills as well. And localization, which is increasingly, as supply chains are becoming riskier, and I think we'll particularly see this in the wake of the COVID pandemic. This is what the prediction is anyway, that people will shorten their supply chain. So more things will be made closer to home and in country. So that is all good for the African free trade area. But what's happened is that services is a very big part, more than 50% in most economies. There's a huge growth of this in the services sector, but actually there's a lack of dynamism in the sector as well. The growth is actually not as high as you would think when you read a lot about it, a lot of articles and things. But the growth is relatively low compared to global growth. Those figures there are a little bit old, but I don't think it's changed too much. Excuse me. And then the other issue on the horizon is, and it's not clear yet how it will affect industrialization, is automation, or the fourth industrial revolution, as some people like to call it, where basically you might see manufacturing going up or industrialization taking place, but you won't see job growth because of the artificial intelligence and automation that is becoming very much part of this. So the other thing, the big thing that we talk a lot about these issues that people don't focus on enough, in my view, because I think this is absolutely critical, is how competitive African countries are. If we're going to export things, even if they are to each other, how competitive are we? How competitive are the pricing, the quality, the time to market, all of these issues. And so this is now the 2019 competitiveness index. You'll find Mauritius is actually at the top of just about every index these days. South Africa much less so, but these small island states, Seychelles as well, and these smaller countries. At the 17 of the bottom 20 on the list are all African. So that is something to also think about. If we're going to industrialize, we have to make sure we are competitive. Otherwise, it's not going to work as optimally. And this similarly, the Doing Business rankings of the World Bank. And so if you look there, they cover, I think, 6 or 7 different categories. I've just listed the top ones in 2020, including starting a business. So there's the main ranking, which you'll see next to the country name, and then there's the different rankings for different parts of the things that are measured. And if you look at the starting a business rankings, and even things like getting electricity, a lot of countries are very, very low down on that. That's out of 190 countries. Now, these are the critical things to just in generally building inclusive growth in African markets. But it's amazing that countries can actually look at these things and still not do much about them, it seems. South Africa has done very few reforms in terms of these doing business rankings in the last couple of years, unlike some like Mauritius, Rwanda in particular, and even Nigeria this past year. Again, the worst performers, if you compare this to the last slide, you'll see there are many of the same countries. Now, remembering that we are all in this together, the African Free Trade Area is an African play. It's not regional. Well, it is regional to an extent, but I mean, we're all in this. If you look at how badly some of these countries are doing on these various indices, that is a cause of concern. Challenges, many of those, I'm not going to go through each of these, but high cost environments, and that gets back to the competitiveness issue. I mean, African countries are mostly high cost environments for all sorts of reasons, a lot to do with the cost of power, the cost of, the infrastructure deficits, the fact that the railways don't work in a lot of places, the congestion in ports, and a whole range of issues, and compliance issues as well. Africa is very highly regulated in many ways, and often not to the benefit of, it doesn't serve much purpose. So very high cost environments, which does lessen our competitiveness. And meeting international certification, I mean, these are big issues and big expensive issues, and we don't really have a lot of infrastructure in that regard in Africa, including sort of testing facilities and so on for goods to go into international markets. And limited information about trade advantages. One of the things that came up from the African Development Bank is that businesses don't really understand a lot about these various trade, even the previous SADC and COMESA and all of these other trade blocks, and what they could get out of it. So there's a lot of issues that people have to keep up, otherwise they're not going to have it to their benefit. And I've mentioned a few of these already, the growth of automation and the high level of services, as opposed to nascent industry. It's not big enough. And a mindset, I've spoken to a lot of people over time who think a lot of smaller companies, SMEs, don't believe that manufacturing is they think it's a multinational company, it's a big thing. They don't feel that that it's much easier to be in services or something else. So then it requires a change of mindset to say that, we can actually make things, whether it be value addition to food or other things. So that also is an issue. And Africa is also, as things stand, for a lot of the reasons we've just spoken about, not well integrated into global supply chains. And North and Sub-Saharan Africa are actually sort of heading in different directions. North Africa, much more integrated with Middle East and Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa with Asia. And also it's come back to competitiveness. Do we have are we digitally connected sufficiently to be part of global supply chains? If you're producing a part for example, Boeing, out of South Africa or out of Botswana, you need to be on a par with the entire global chain. You can't be having excuses about there's a strike on or there's a power cut. You have to be, if you're going to enter into that play in that space, you have to be globally competitive, and this is what a lot of governments maybe don't realize, that when they look at policies or where they don't address issues like broadband access and look even down to the ports and market development and things like that. What is required is there's three main categories to be part of a global supply chain: price, time to market, and quality. And if you can't keep up with those in terms of because of the environment that you're in, then that's a real problem. Then you can't play in that space. So that actually, I think in some cases, has driven people out of Africa in order to be set up elsewhere where they can actually do that. So these are things we have to, these all play into the bigger picture. And the requirements for a lot of certification issues and so on are set in developed markets. So if we're going to export to each other, does that mean we lower the bar? Do we take into account more local realities in terms of setting the standards for moving across borders? And in terms of standardizing things, how do we do that? I mean, I think there's a lot of mindset issues here that we have to think about. And then also unsupported bureaucracy. That's a huge issue across Africa, and policy and regulation and things like that. Governments always say they're going to undo the roadblocks to doing business, but in fact, what they tend to do is they pick winners. They'll say, well, we'll look at developing this industry of it, so we'll allow them special export or import incentives and so on, instead of actually making the whole environment better for everybody, in which case you don't need to focus on specific areas. And rules of origin has been a big sticking point in trade generally, it's been there's a lot of disagreement still within the. I'm sure you're aware of the tripartite free trade area, which covers COMESA, East African Community, and SADC, where it was launched in 2015, and it still hasn't really got off the ground. And rules of origin and other issues are big sticking points. Now, that is probably, I'd say, 2/3 of African countries. So why do we think that if we can't get that right, that we're going to be able to get a much bigger entity right? So those are issues for the people who are negotiating, but they're just something to be aware of. And the issues are, predominance of SMEs. It is harder to scale. It is harder to move into manufacturing, depending on the size of your company and the skills you have available, and so on. The level of agricultural outputs, if you look at a lot of countries, we don't have, agriculture often drives manufacturing, and we're not seeing the level of agricultural outputs. They're not sufficient in many countries to be able to be part of the value chain through manufacturing. And power deficits, also just the difficulty of moving goods around the continent. I don't know if anyone's been through Bight Bridge lately, or one of these road border posts, road borders, incredibly difficult. And it's getting better in parts, but it's patchy, and some border posts are still incredibly difficult to move through as trucks laden with goods. And so that's a huge issue. And no amount of years and years of trade facilitation don't seem to have addressed that issue as yet. And also, I think that, we have another issue. There's a lot of protectionism in Africa, and despite there's a lot of talk about free trade, but actually what happens on the ground is that there's a lot of protectionism. And I don't know whether in the post-COVID, there's talk that the free trade area will start trading, and from January or so onwards. But we'll be in a sort of hopefully, a post-COVID era. And what we've seen during the COVID pandemic, of course, is closed borders, very national, people internally focused, looking at how to rebuild their own economies and so on. And it'd be interesting to see whether governments will have the capacity or the willingness to actually look outwards and see the advantage of regional recovery strategies rather than national, because already you have a very strong predisposition to national strategies, which accounts for high levels of non-tariff barriers. Even as the barriers come down, tariffs, the other things pop up, and they're often ad hoc and so on. So that'll be interesting to see. This protectionism it's a real mindset across Africa in governments. And these are just some of the suggestions. I think, business government trust, there's certainly not enough. The countries that succeed, you often find that there is engagement and real engagement, not just talking and sort of things like NEDLAC, where it's opportunities where business is really brought in as part of the national planning, and also the economic diplomacy, that the business and government work together. And that doesn't happen in a lot of places. Excuse me. It does happen in Mauritius, which, as I pointed out earlier, where they're at the top of many indices out there. And of course, the improved business environment, and that's absolutely non-negotiable in terms of making this thing work. So basically, when governments say they need to look at the roadblocks and remove them, that is what they need to do. And they need to ask business, what are the roadblocks, rather than deciding off their own bat what they think the roadblocks are. And also a balance between realism and sentiment. There's a lot of policies that are based on, this is what we want, you put in place harsh quotas for things and targets and so on that aren't realistic, and then it seems things seem to fail. It creates ill will maybe among investors and others. So it's important to keep a realistic. We all want this thing to work, but maybe it needs a bit of time. We've got a lot of stuff to work through. And these things are, I think, they're common investment rules, standardization across borders, removal of non-tariff barriers, etc., and protectionist policies. Those are all absolutely essential. And that sounds easy. It looks like a very easy list, but actually it's the mindset, the political will and the mindset that's one of the hardest things to actually address. Often the things that are holding up business and investment are something that a minister can address. They don't require huge amounts of money, although you will often hear that actually Africa doesn't have the money to do this and that. It's often not about the money, it's about the political will to actually just do something, to change something, and requires, simply changing the level of seniority required to sign off something, or changing a simple policy or whatever. So so those were just some of my ideas. I just wanted to talk very briefly about 3 areas that also impact on this. One was about Zimbabwe, where I talked a little bit about how manufacturing and agriculture are aligned. And what you found in Zimbabwe is, after the land invasions, and a lot of farming was disrupted, and in fact it was ruined. I can't think of the word I need now, but so basically what you saw in Zimbabwe was that the manufacturing to GDP percentage went right down in both the manufacturing and agricultural sectors. In agriculture, from 20% of GDP to 8%. That's between 2008, which was the end of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, and in the last 2 years or so. And manufacturing went down from 31% of GDP to 21%. It's probably lower than that. I think that's the figure they're admitting to. But at one time, you saw capacity utilization of manufacturing in Zimbabwe was right down to 5% at the height of hyperinflation. So that means, and Zimbabwe was built on import substitution. Well, not Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. And that has formed a kind of a backbone for industrialization going forward into the independent Zimbabwe and onwards. And the import substitution was very successful for the purpose it served at the time. But after the economy opened up, they found there were a lot of goods that were being made that actually were much easier and cheaper to import. So there's the issues around that as well. Another country that's looking strongly at import substitution, but is also highly protectionist in other ways, is Nigeria. And they've been driving their trade policy with import restrictions and import bans since the 1970s. So, and I think it raises, and still very import dependent country. It is starting to change, but one of the problems is that it is putting these bans in place without capacitating the rest of the economy to be able to deliver is a problem. It's just a shortcut that policymakers take. They don't put in the hard yards to make sure the economy can actually benefit from that. So that's another issue there. And also the third issue and last thing I'm going to address is Ethiopia, where they have put in place very successfully. They've built these industrial zones where a lot of Chinese companies have come and invested in producing textiles for the export markets in America and elsewhere. And the dilemma they had was about wages, and this is a big issue as well with industrialization. Do you give somebody a job at any cost in order to start building a value chain in industry, or do you make sure you give people, you go much more slowly, and you make sure that you can afford higher wages from the outset? And Ethiopia put in place, they became the cheapest place to do textile exports in the world. So of course the Chinese came to take advantage of that, among other things. And so really it's a trade-off. They were very much criticized for doing that, but it is a trade-off. So these are all issues to consider in this kind of discussion around industrialization. It's a very big topic, and I've just whipped through a couple of things here. So I don't know whether you've got some questions or whether you'd like to discuss any of these issues a little bit more. I'm going to hand over to the chair and close my slides so we can talk a little bit more. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dianna. Thank you so much for taking us through on what you think is the basis for industrialization in Africa. Of course, as I said at the beginning, it's a very interesting kind of a personal outline. And as you said, I would like to echo what you have said. This is a very big topic, which you couldn't have been really able to tackle on a day, because it's composed of a number of facets, as well as a number of aspects which need to be sliced one by one. But you have been able to really enlighten us on your own personal perspectives, taking us through to a number of issues which you feel that they will have to be addressed for the continent to be able to fully industrialize. It's a work in progress. There are opportunities and there are challenges. And surely one of the biggest challenge in the continent are those countries that are still trapped in the war situation. where priorities are not necessarily to industrialize, but to bring peace and stability. Mozambique is one of the countries which are making an example. We're being targeted to be on the path of industrialization, but unfortunately now is faced with Islamic extremists. So it's a bag full of a number of opportunities and challenges. And having said that, so far 2 questions has propped up. I'm going to read them to you. The first one came from Sia Togozam Dolo, who said, what might be the role of regionalism in attempt to improve the level of industrialization within the continent? He said, regionalism for the local economic community to the interactions between the different African economic communities and their adherence to regulations by the African Continental Free Trade Area and World Trade Organization. The second question came from Tony Mudau, who said, how should the African labor market be organized for efficient industrialization? Let's tackle those 2 for now.
Just to point out quickly, there's also a hand up from Mbofo Lowo.
Okay, let's take 2 and 2 and then we move forward. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Do you want to start with the hand up? I can't see it.
Let's take the 2 that I've read, and then we will then go to the hands up, and then take Zobanzi, who also has a question.
Okay, I'm going to start with the role of regionalism in improving the level of industrialization. I think the thing to remember about the African Free Trade Area, that the thinking behind it is based on scale. We need to build scale in Africa because we have a lot of small economies, and we have a lot of landlocked countries that need to be able to move across borders and so on. And currently, the border issues are difficult because you don't have standardization of goods and packaging and labeling and all these requirements across borders. So you make something in one country and you want to sell it in another one, you've got to, in some cases, for example, put specific labeling on that is required by, for example, I don't know, Cameroon or another country where you want to sell. So, and there's also this issue of scale and bringing together resources, looking at there's been a lot of talk of hubs, having, for example, Zimbabwe producing one particular thing and South Africa producing another, etc. And so that you're building scale within these economies, and rather than everybody making the same thing and exporting the same thing. I don't know how that works, given what I said about the protectionism and the mindset issues. But it's clear that there's a lot of political will behind the African Free Trade Area, and hopefully that will address the issue of political will to do this. I think it's just trying to see who benefits and so on. So I think there's no doubt that regionalism will improve the ability to industrialize. You can have much more sharing of resources, whether that be power. If there's already projects that are regional. The North-South Corridor, I don't know if you've heard about that. That was a big international project in Africa, basically to improve the facility of trade from Tanzania all the way down to South Africa and offshore. And that involved a lot of cross-border projects in energy, in power, in transport, road building, rail, across the board. And I think that's what's required, is making it easier to trade and leveraging resources and scale. Those are the key parts of this African Free Trade Area. Those are the things that really motivate people. And that's what we need, because all of these economies are struggling with similar issues. And if you pool your resources, clearly that would make it easier. In terms of actually producing things, I don't know. I think, I'm not an expert in how they've forged this within the free trade area, how politically that would work, and how countries would say, well, you have a competitive advantage in this, so maybe you should look at producing that. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but I think there's no doubt that on a broad level that regionalization is definitely the answer to this. What is the second question now? Thoughts on regulatory framework? Oh,
The
labor
second
market,
question.
the
Yeah,
labor market.
yes.
Oh, again, I think it gets back to, is there? I think there's a lot of room for the African Union to play a role in making setting kind of templates. It's not quite the right word, but to say, okay, these are the recommendations that we make, so that we can't. In terms of the wages, this is how it's going to happen. We can't pay below a certain wage, or we must agree that this is how it's going to work. But each country has very specific issues in terms of jobs and employment, and you'll already find that if you look at there was a lot of flourish around signing the African Free Trade Area, but there's been a lot less appetite for signing up on protocols on the free movement of people. And there's a lot of issues around that in terms of the movement of skills. People are trying to protect jobs rather than to open up their economies to having foreigners, maybe more skilled foreigners, even other Africans, or maybe particularly other Africans coming into their markets and working in particular jobs. If you look at regional projects, I mean, I think there needs to be some guidance on how employment in those projects might work, and the breakdown and so on. So I think we'll have to wait and see how this labor thing pans out. But I do know that there is quite a resistance still to this free movement of people, which underpins this whole labor story. So we'll have to see. I think there's only 5 or 6 countries, maybe just a few more, that have signed up to these protocols on free movement. So that is a very different kind of issue that needs to be tackled. And it's fine. I think in East African community, they've dealt with it in a particular way. They have opened up the movement of labor across that region. But if you're talking about the whole continent, East African community is a bite-sized chunk, if you like. The whole continent is a much bigger place, and the inequalities are much more considerable. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but those are my thoughts on it. We have hands up. We were going to do 2 hands up after that.
Yes, no problem. Yeah, let's give the first one and then we take the second one. Thank you.
Okay, is that Ben? Hello, is anyone there?
Please unmute yourself and then you talk.
Oh, I'm unmute myself. Okay.
No. I mean the people who.
Who's got their hand up? Just unmute yourself so I can hear you.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi.
Yeah, it's Mbokoro Tedu from CHIPS. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Dianna. I guess 3 points from my side. I saw there was a question about regionalism as well. So I guess my starting point is around whether African countries are actually working on industrializing their value chains in a way that is productive, in a sense. I think TIPS just recently had a forum on this as well, around regional integration as well. And the main issue became around regional value chains and how we are actually all competing with each other. All of our industrial policies basically speak to developing the same industries in each of our individual countries instead of sort of working and feeding off of each other. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that in terms of how do we actually then break down this industrialization plan for Africa, and who must concentrate on what, and whether we're actually working towards integrating in that sense, and whether the FCTA will help in that sense. Second point would be around the investment industrialization nexus, let me call it that. We need investment to actually industrialize, but issues around local content, issues around labor, like you're raising now, those are the things that hamper these things. We want to industrialize, but these companies will not hand over technology to us. So we're basically trapped in assembly. And, when they say local content, they hired a local cleaning firm, they hired a local accounting firm, but the actual work still resides wherever the actual intellectual property, the actual value addition happens somewhere else, So there's also that issue, and how do we tackle that? Because if the investors are not actually on board with the developmental objectives that we're trying to achieve, why do we think then we can get them? And then I think the third point is one of the main recommendations that you put forward.
Can we limit ourselves to 2? Otherwise, it's going to be long.
All right,
Thank you for
last
watching.
one.
Highly appreciated. Let's get
Last
the second.
one.
Are you going to be short?
It was just on one of the main recommendations she put forward was around business trust.
Yes.
I don't know what this policy uncertainty actually is. What is not certain? South Africa, as a case in point, private industry is sitting on a stash of money that they're not willing to invest. Yeah, I think what is this policy uncertainty that, what is the trust that has been broken? Yes, corruption is a major issue and all, but also I think there's a disconnect between what the developmental objectives of the region and Africa is versus what then is expected as a compensation for who the investors are. Thank you.
Pleasure. Dianna, you want to take a second one, or you're going to handle these 3?
Well, I think that's quite a chunk of stuff. So this is probably, these questions are probably a webinar all by themselves. So I'm not sure I can go into all the detail that's required here, but let me just touch very briefly on a few things. In terms of the regional value chains, I actually did tune into that TIPS webinar the other day, and I heard people saying, nothing has changed. We've all got these ideas and there's plans and visions and all put forward, but these are not being implemented in terms of these regional industrialization plans. I certainly believe, and I don't know the details of all these different plans, but I certainly believe that it's how do you share the spoils, if I can put it this way. Everyone has a development objective in mind, but the question is, how do you kind of spread that out? Should it be a case of sharing the things out in that kind of way, and saying, well, you do this, you have a competitive, I think there's an argument to say you have a competitive advantage here because you have a really good access to power and we don't, so therefore let's think about this and that. But are countries really willing to share like that? I'm not sure we're there yet, and maybe this is the free trade area is a stepping stone towards that, to deciding how you do that. Because I think what most countries are looking at thinking is like, we're going to do more and better, and we'll reap the rewards of that on a national basis. And if you look at SADC, and we've had trade areas, this African free trade area is often painted as something new. It's not new. It's basically an agglomeration, of course, under a different and more sympathetic and more advanced umbrella. But it's an agglomeration of all these trade areas that have existed for a long time across the continent, from west to east, north, south. So I think we have to look at the issues that have been part of these and why they haven't worked optimally in other parts within these other blocks, to really see what needs to be done and why these things haven't worked. And I imagine, I think that these regional issues, it's not that they've come up before. If you look at SADC, they've got very all sorts of regional plans within that. And as someone who works for TIPS, I'm assuming that you may be more familiar with those. But I think it's a mindset issue that we're going to have to work on, because how do you avoid, as I say, share the spoils? I can't think of a more technical way to put that. In terms of investment in local content, etc., I think there's a bit of an us and them thing that you conveying in your questions, and I think that's exactly what I was talking about. There does seem to have been this development of an us and them thinking, and I think maybe the both sides don't really understand, or maybe not taking time to understand the challenges that each one is having. Global companies, for example, if you're talking about they as being international companies rather than African companies, which your question did seem to suggest, I think that's very different from local companies, and you've got a lot of local manufacturing companies across Africa as well, or multinationals that have local operations. I think they feel that they are doing, they're localizing, they're doing a lot of stuff in terms of development and so on, whether it be through CSI, etc. I don't know. But the government thinks they're not, and the companies feel that the governments could do a lot more to make bureaucracy easier, to make it cheaper to do business. I think moving the goalpost is really in terms of the uncertainty issues. They don't, it's a case of, what if they're going to change the policy overnight. Regulatory uncertainty across Africa is one of the biggest risks that companies talk about, and those are local companies as well as international companies. because they feel, I think it speaks to the lack of trust, that there's not enough proper discussion and engagement that makes people feel certain that the government won't suddenly do something that will affect their business overnight, and deal with the consequences. So those are just very briefly, I'm not going into the detail of all of this, just one last word on local content. The point about local content is there are rules about it. So you need to make sure the rules work. And as I said, you need to be realistic. I was listening the other day to a Nigerian, it might even, I don't know if it was in your conference, but a Nigerian from the Nigerian oil industry, from the local content board, they put a local content act in place in 2010. And they started out, they were going to have 70% local content in 10 years, or in 2 years. I can't remember the framework, but by the target time, they only had about 30%. And they said the biggest lesson they'd learned was to balance your sentiments with your expectations, to be realistic about your targets, because otherwise, firstly, you put off investors who say, well, it's too hard, we'll go somewhere else where it isn't quite as hard as this. They might also, it may not be about a developmental objective, but about whether the country is able to deliver on those local content goals. So you can't say, well, we're going to build skills from nothing in a period of 2 years, and companies must now spend money to do that in order to invest in our country. You have to be realistic about the targets you put in place. And once you are, you have to back it up with law. You can't just expect companies to say, well, okay, thanks, that looks great, we'll try and do our best. You have to say, this is what's going to happen and this is the time frame. But I think that, as I say, as the Nigerian example points out, you do have to be realistic about those targets. Okay, so that's, okay, next question.
Thank you. Let's take another hands up. Unmute yourself and ask the question.
Romilda. Okay, anyone?
Can I, Chair?
Yes.
If I'm able to suggest, are you not able to pick up some of the questions from the group? Either you can ask them directly, or you can just call out a name to ask that question.
No, there are questions that have popped up, but take their hands, and those who have just listed the questions and posted the questions. They are flowing, and I'm aware of them, but I was just clearing the balance that, yes, we have the first person, and we need a second one.
Okay.
So I see.
Unmute yourself, Crimelda. You need to unmute yourself.
All right, while Camilda is busy, okay.
Okay.
Okay, she disappeared. Let me just go on to this question in the interest of time, because we are running out of time here. Okay, I'm just looking at the question here. Any thoughts on the argument that the regulatory framework may prove too complicated for the poorer African countries? And the tendency, bilateral trade with Western countries, empower these countries in a complex regulatory environment. This is the fact that there's such differences in the globalization, if you like, of so many African economies, and their economic advancement and so on. The fact that there's such a differential between countries is a huge sticking point, and I think the free trade area deals with it by giving time frames for different countries to reach certain different points. But I think that is going to be a real blockage. If you look at SADC, for example, I mean, SADC launched without two of its biggest economies, when that's Angola and the DRC. I don't think they even to this day have acceded to the SADC agreement. I could be wrong. I think DRC might have, but maybe. So you're looking at a lot of very poor countries. I mean, Africa has I think 33 countries categorized as least developed countries. That's an official categorization if you want to look it up, and that gives them a lot of development advantages and so on. But it also shows that they are very constrained in a lot of ways in terms of their development indices and targets and so on. So I think it is, I don't know if it's about regulatory only. I think you'll find in a lot of poor countries, there's over-regulation, because regulation can often be an easy way to raise revenues. So in fact, what they do is they constrain the ability of particularly SMEs to grow and scale and to even operate in a lot of these very poor countries. You'll find that it's as countries advance and they become more sophisticated, they start opening up a lot more. I mean, Nigeria is a bit of an exception in some ways, but because it is highly protectionist at the moment, but I think that's what you tend to find. But I think that is going to be a problem, these very, very different levels of not just development, but exposure of openness to sharing, you know, and sharing resources, and taking away short-term things that produce short-term revenue gains but are long-term constraints on growth. And you see that in a lot of countries, and even the bigger countries. And I might just, as a small example, use air travel. I've just been reading about something just this week about the cost of landing fees for African countries, and a lot of the costs associated with flights. And of course, that is seen as an elite thing, but basically there could be more flights. It could be a lot cheaper to fly in Africa if a lot of these short-term costs and a lot of these short-term revenue generating things are to do with exports and moving things across borders. So whether countries are prepared to look at the long-term view of raising revenue and taking away the short-term benefits of revenue that they have in place is another story. All right, do we have any more hands up? Otherwise, I'm just looking further down these questions. So Melanie, have you got, can you ask, I'm not, I don't know if you've been reading while I've been talking. I've just got another one here. Africa is what is termed a population and youth dividend. However, this dividend cannot be reaped because of inequality and lack of education. What are the industrial strategies to be adopted to ensure we industrialize? Well, I think the first thing is that education, and it's not just in Africa, education across the world is not really prepared sufficiently for this fourth industrial revolution. And in fact, in Africa, not for the third industrial revolution either, or possibly even the second. And education is the one place where interventions can be very real and can scale quite quickly. And it's just a pity that the outputs in education pretty much across Africa are much lower than they could be. And you don't have people in many countries even finishing their full term at school. So I think a lot more could be built into the education system too. And again, it talks to mindset changes, and also just basic productivity issues, thinking about SMEs, how to innovation, and all of these things could be addressed at the school level, because these are skills that we often told are going to be needed in the future. And then certainly if we're going to industrialize, these are skills. And as I say, it's not always just about the skills, it's about the way of thinking about things, and accepting and embracing technology and other things that needs to be dealt with. And that can certainly be done at an education level. Ethiopian approach.
Yeah,
yeah, okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Okay.
The higher versus lower wages. Well, the Ethiopian government reckons that they've got no skills, and this also talks a little bit to the local content story, where they have not developed. Ethiopia has been a very closed economy for a very long time. I mean, they're only opening up a lot of sectors in the last few years. So there isn't a historical or generational, if you like, skills development model in Ethiopia. So a lot of people are working in corporate jobs for the first time. They're learning new skills. They're working in these kind of environments. So the government feels that in order to build these skills, what it wanted to do was to make it as easy as possible for investors to bring their money to Ethiopia and set up these factories in these special zones. And so they came in at a sort of bargain basement wage, if you like, and the government's thinking was better to build. We need to build something, and we are building it from scratch. So we can't actually price ourselves out of the market when we don't have a skilled workforce. So rather we build this thing on the back of giving people jobs, but if we set the wages too high and we have no skilled labor or little skilled labor, you know, people are not going to come. If they're going to pay too much, they can still go to Bangladesh or other places if the prices are comparable, the wage levels rather. So it's a case of the trade-off was to bring investors to Ethiopia and start the process of industrialization off a low base. And then hopefully start moving up the industrialization scale. Maybe those people who've now learned skills with these Chinese companies could perhaps move into light industry, into local companies who want to scale, and so on. So that was their thinking on the trade-off. A lot of people will say, well, if people are earning so little, they're not actually moving up any kind of value chain. I guess that remains to be seen, and that's what a lot of people are saying. We don't want to be the labor, the labor pool of the world at any price. But labor is a strategic advantage for companies who employ a lot of people, like industry, for example. So these are all issues out there. These are not my thoughts. I'm quoting what the Ethiopians were thinking in doing it this way. So it's really a employment or no employment. Is it decent jobs versus unemployment? These are all issues that I'm relying on all you students out there to tackle and start writing articles about, so we can give it some more thought. Okay, anything else? Should we have a synchronized industrial policy? I'm sorry if I'm missing any questions. I'm just scrolling a bit here. In Africa, taking lessons
I wanted to direct it from so that at least you focus on answering the question. There's one which came from Mzobanzi, where she said, should we have a synchronized industrial policy in Africa, taking lessons from the disintegration of EU? And he said, if yes, which African industrial policy framework should Africa use?
That's a detailed technical question. So I'm not sure I'm going to really answer that, because I don't feel equipped to make those comparisons. But I think it's, I would argue that maybe it's too soon, that we've got a lot of other things to work through before we can build that scale that's needed to even get anywhere to where the EU got to. In its heyday, but there's a lot of people better equipped to talk about, so I'm not going to really take that question. Sorry about that. I'm sure there's plenty of other people who could answer it, though.
No problem. The other one which I pick up relates to the youth dividend concept of.
Oh yes, I saw that.
Yes, can you just comment on that, please?
Well, the thing with the youth dividend, and this is why, for the first time, and as I said to you, I've been traveling around this continent a lot. I've been to many hundreds of conferences at the AU, all over the continent. And I've heard many, many ministers, presidents, everybody speaking over the years, different ones. And the one thing that's the youth story and the job story have been things that have never really gained much traction. And a lot of countries, people sort of live past their governments, and so they don't rely on the government to provide jobs for them or houses or anything. Actually, they people get on with their lives, and they've built an incredible resilience in order to be able to do that. And so they provide jobs for themselves, and that speaks to, at some level, the fact that there's very high levels of informal employment across Africa. Most countries have probably half of the jobs that exist, or the economic activity is in an informal kind of sector. But I think what's happening, I think the real game changer that I've seen is technology, the advent of technology and mobile phones. And this is something that the youth are very attuned to, and I think that this is the way that governments and policymakers and companies and everybody, all the stakeholders, could certainly make a big difference fairly quickly through technology, through innovation, and to move forward in these ways. I think there's much more appetite for entrepreneurship these days. Before, people used to want to work for a company. Now people are prepared to or keen to work for themselves and build small companies. But I think the point is that not everyone can just be a small company. Economies, in order to grow, have to have some kind of scale, and they have to make things, and otherwise they're going to have to import them, make them or grow them and sell them. I mean, that's how countries become rich. So I think there's there's a nexus of technology and a growing youth population, and hopefully these two things benefit each other. Whereas before there was technology, it was much harder for people to actually for the youth dividend to be realized. There's also a lot of companies, a lot of money going into this youth employment challenge, and I think for the first time I'm seeing governments really taking it seriously too. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but those are some of my thoughts on it. Okay, I think
yes, as you said, it's not necessarily a matter of providing the sweeping answer to any question, but just to share the views. And I've decided to show myself, because it seems as if people were wondering, who is this person? And And allow me then, in the interest of time, to express again my word of thanks for you to find time to come and share your views with us. I think they were very much important and an eye-opener to all of us. And also then last big thank goes to the audience, because without them, this seminar wouldn't have been possible. And I think they've gained something. And whatever problem maybe you were unable to provide convincing answers, I mean, there's still another seminar tomorrow. And Vio actually has just put his head on the block by saying that he will tackle some of the issues which have been touched today tomorrow. So colleagues, allow me to thank each and every one of you and say goodbye.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Dianna.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.